Some fathers teach their sons how to live. This man taught his son how to endure. From the time the boy could stand, he was worked harder than any animal on the land, not by strangers, not by hunger alone, but by his own father, a man who believed love made boys weak and mercy destroyed men. To the outside world, the father appeared disciplined, respected, even admirable. To his son, he was a presence that never rested. The land they lived on was narrow and stubborn, pressed between a dry ridge and a line of trees that swallowed light early in the evening. It was not the kind of place people chose for comfort. The father said that was the point. Good land spoiled a man. Easy soil made soft hands. Hard ground, he believed, revealed character. The boy's mother died before the land ever learned his name. She faded quietly, like something worn down rather than broken. Afterward, the house changed its sound. The walls seemed farther apart. Even the wind felt louder moving through the gaps. No one explained death to the boy. He learned it the way he learned everything else, by watching and staying silent. The morning after the burial, the father woke him before the sky had color. There was no speech, no pause, no allowance for grief. A hand shook his shoulder once. That was all. The boy rose, confused and stiff, and followed his father outside. The tools were already laid out. Work did not wait for sorrow. The father believed children were unfinished men. He believed the faster they were shaped, the better they held their form. He did not raise his voice often. He did not need to. His certainty carried its own weight. When he spoke, it was as if he was stating a fact that could not be argued. Like the coming of winter, or the setting of the sun, the boy learned early that questions slowed the day. Slowness was treated as resistance. Resistance was corrected. At 6, the boy was given tasks meant for older hands. He carried water in buckets that scraped his knees. He dragged sacks that left lines across his shoulders. When he stumbled, the father did not rush to help. He waited. Watching was part of the lesson. The boy learned to stand back up without looking for approval. By 7, the word useful had entered his life. It was not spoken warmly. It was spoken as a measurement. Tools were useful. Animals were useful. A boy who could work without complaint earned the same description. Usefulness meant permission to remain. Mornings began before the birds. The father woke him with the same firm shake every day, regardless of weather, regardless of how late the night had stretched. Bread was eaten standing. Water was swallowed quickly. There were no conversations meant to linger. Then the work began. The father showed each task once, slowly, precisely. After that, the boy was expected to understand. Mistakes were not treated as learning. They were treated as choices. The correction was immediate and physical, but never emotional. That distinction mattered deeply to the father. He believed anger weakened judgment. What he did in his mind was necessary. When the boy's hands bled, the father wrapped them without comment and sent him back to work. Blood was a condition, not an excuse. People in the nearby town admired the father. They called him strong. They said he was raising a boy who would never be useless in a failing world. Men nodded when they passed the land and saw the child bent beside his father, lifting and hauling without protest. Discipline looked impressive from a distance. No one asked how the boy slept. No one asked what he thought about while working. At night, the boy lay on his narrow bed and listened to the father sharpening tools. The sound carried through the house, steady and patient. Sometimes the blades were already sharp. Sometimes the work went on long after it needed to. The boy learned to associate that sound with harder days ahead. He was never wrong. The father believed softness invited ruin. He had learned that belief from his own father and from the years that followed. He survived. That was all the proof he needed. Survival was the highest form of success he recognized. By 10, the boy's hands no longer looked like a child's. They were thickened, rough, slow to close fully in the mornings. His back had begun to curve forward slightly, as if already bracing for weight that had not yet arrived. When other children passed by laughing, He kept his eyes down. The father did not forbid him from speaking to them. He simply ensured there was never time. The boy did not resent the work at first. Resentment required comparison, and he had none. This was the only life he knew, the only rhythm his body understood. When he was praised, it was through silence. When he disappointed, the punishment was not shouting. It was added labor, usually after dark. When the cold settled deeper into the ground, the father stood nearby during these punishments, arms folded, watching with an intensity that felt almost clinical. He studied effort the way other men studied weather. When the boy's breathing changed, when his movements slowed, when his hands trembled, the father took note. Endurance, he believed, could be trained. Sundays were the hardest days. While other families rested, the father assigned the heaviest tasks. He said rest should be earned weekly, not assumed. The boy learned to dread the sound of church bells drifting from town. They marked the beginning of longer hours. There were moments, brief and dangerous, when the boy wondered if something was wrong. Once, during a delivery, he watched a man laugh as his son stumbled beside him. The man reached out, steadying the child without thinking. The gesture was small, careless, and it unsettled the boy more than anger ever had. He looked away before his father noticed. At 13, the work shifted. It grew heavier, more deliberate. The father began preparing him for full responsibility. Instructions became fewer. Expectations became absolute. The boy was no longer corrected as often. Failure was now treated as defiance. When the boy's shoulders slumped from fatigue, the father tied a rope across his back, pulling him upright as he worked. He said nothing while doing it. He did not need to. The boy understood the message clearly. Posture was discipline made visible. Pain became something the boy noticed and moved past. Hunger was familiar. Rest felt suspicious. His body learned to obey before his thoughts could interfere. He stopped crying early. Tears wasted water and time. The father took pride in the fact that he never struck his son in anger. He believed this separated him from cruel men. Every blow had a purpose. Every correction was justified. In his mind, this made him fair. By 16, the boy's joints ached in the mornings. His hands sometimes trembled when he tried to hold them still. He learned to hide it. Weakness was a private failure. The father did not tolerate complaints. Pain, he said, was the body learning its place. The father began to rely on him more heavily. Tasks once done alone were now shared, then slowly handed over. The boy became the engine that kept the land functioning. He worked longer hours without being told. He anticipated needs before they were spoken. The father noticed this and approved, though approval never came in words. The shift was subtle, but the boy felt it. He noticed how the father rested longer between tasks, how his breathing grew heavier, how his hands shook slightly when he thought no one was watching. The boy said nothing. Observation had been trained into him as thoroughly as obedience. At night, lying awake, the boy sometimes imagined leaving. The thought felt dangerous, almost forbidden. He had no money, no schooling, no name beyond the land. The world beyond the ridge existed only as rumor and fear. Leaving would mean becoming useless somewhere else. And yet something had begun to change inside him. Not hope, something colder, something patient. The father continued to speak of control, of order, of how a man must dominate his circumstances or be crushed by them. He believed he had shaped his son perfectly. Strong, silent, reliable, a bit continuation of himself. What he did not see was that the boy's obedience no longer came from fear. It came from understanding. He understood the rhythms of exhaustion. He understood the value of silence. He understood that power could slow, and as the father aged, just enough for the boy to notice, the land remained as unforgiving as ever. The ground did not soften for loyalty. The seasons did not respect effort. The rules the father had built his life upon showed no interest in sparing him now. The boy watched. He worked, he waited, because some lessons take a lifetime to reveal their cost. By the time the boy became a man, the land no longer felt large. It felt measured. Every fence post, every worn path, every patch of soil carried the memory of his hands. He knew where the ground softened after rain and where it stayed hard enough to split skin. He knew which tools dulled quickly and which held their edge longer than expected. The place had shaped him, but he had shaped it back in quiet, unnoticed ways. The father had not planned for this balance to shift. In his mind, authority did not erode. It transferred downward intact like an heirloom. He believed control could be passed on without ever being questioned. But age does not announce itself all at once. It arrives in small betrayals. The father's knees began to trouble him first, not enough to stop him from working, but enough to slow him in ways he did not acknowledge. He paused more often, resting his hands on his thighs, staring at the ground as if calculating something invisible. When the boy noticed and adjusted his pace to match, the father snapped at him for hovering. "I'm not finished," he said sharply. The boy stepped back and waited. He had learned when to move and when to disappear. The waiting was its own kind of labor. As seasons passed, the father's strength became less reliable. He still woke before dawn, still insisted on leading the day, but there were moments when his grip failed him. A tool slipped. A load was set down sooner than intended. Each time his jaw tightened. Each time he said nothing. Silence had always been his refuge. The boy did not offer help unless asked. That was another lesson learned early. Unrequested assistance implied weakness. Weakness offended the father. Instead, the boy worked harder. He took on more without comment. The land did not care who gave the orders, only that the work continued. People in town began to notice the change before the father did. They spoke to the boy directly now, asking questions about yields and repairs. The father stood beside him during these conversations, listening, correcting only when necessary. When the boy answered accurately, the father's expression remained unreadable. Pride, if it existed, never surfaced. The father's authority had always been enforced through presence. He did not need to explain himself because he was always there, watching, measuring. But as his body grew less dependable, his presence began to thin. He spent more time indoors during the heat of the day. He sat longer in the evenings, rubbing his hands together as if warming them, even in summer. The boy noticed everything. By 20, the boy's body carried the weight of decades. His movements were efficient, stripped of anything unnecessary. He spoke rarely. Words felt inefficient, like wasted effort. When he did speak, his voice was steady and low, shaped by years of silence. He had learned to sleep lightly. Even rest was conditional. The sound of tools, being moved or the creak of the door still, pulled him awake instantly. Habit outlived necessity. The father continued to speak of discipline and order, though his lectures shortened. He repeated himself more often, telling the same stories about hard winters and narrow escapes. The boy listened without reaction. Repetition was another sign of age, one he recognized even if the father did not. When mistakes happened now, the consequences shifted. Where once the boy would have been punished with more work, now the father corrected him with words alone. The words carried frustration, but not the same force. They landed differently. One afternoon, the father dropped a tool and did not immediately bend to pick it up. He stared at it for a moment, as if confused by its presence on the ground. The boy watched from a distance, muscles tense, ready to move if called. The father eventually retrieved it, straightening slowly. When he turned, he saw the boy watching. "What are you standing there for?" He snapped. "Waiting," the boy replied. The word hung between them longer than expected. The father looked at him, really looked at him, as if seeing the full shape of what stood in front of him for the first time. The boy did not look away. He did not lower his eyes. That small defiance went unnoticed, lost beneath the father's irritation. From that day forward, the father began assigning tasks from a distance. He sat more often while giving instructions. The boy carried them out without comment. Control was still spoken aloud, but it no longer lived in the father's hands. The land responded well. Yields improved. Repairs were completed more quickly. There was no celebration of this efficiency. The boy did not seek approval, and the father did not offer it. The improvement simply existed, undeniable and unspoken. At night, the father's sleep grew restless. He rose more often, pacing the house in the dark. The boy heard him coughing, heard him muttering to himself in a voice stripped of authority. Once the boy passed him in the hallway and saw fear flicker across the older man's face before it vanished. Neither of them spoke about it. The father's temper shortened. Small delays angered him. Changes unsettled him. When tools were moved or tasks were completed differently than expected, he reacted sharply, then withdrew. The boy learned to anticipate these moments and adjust accordingly. Adaptation had been his education. Despite everything, the father still believed himself indispensable. He spoke as though the land would collapse without his direction. He reminded the boy often of how much he had been given, how much had been invested in him. The boy never argued. He did not need to. Reality was already contradicting those claims. One winter harsher than the others forced the truth closer to the surface. The father fell ill not gravely, but enough to keep him indoors for days at a time. The boy took over completely. He managed the land, the animals, the repairs. He spoke with merchants. He made decisions without consultation. When the father finally emerged, thinner and unsteady, he found everything in order. The fences were mended. The stores were stocked. The animals were fed. Nothing had been neglected. The father's relief was immediate, followed closely by something darker. He walked the land in silence, inspecting the work. The boy followed at a distance, not out of obedience, but out of habit. "You did this," the father said finally. "Yes," the boy replied. The father nodded once. That was all. From then on, the balance tipped more noticeably. The father still claimed authority, but it became symbolic. His instructions often echoed decisions already made. His corrections addressed problems already solved. The boy listened, nodded, and continued. In town, people now addressed the boy as the one in charge. They asked him questions directly. The father watched these exchanges with a tightening expression, saying nothing until they returned home. Then the lectures resumed. Longer now, more defensive. He spoke of sacrifice, of how much he had endured, of how softness would have ruined them both. The boy listened without reaction. He had learned that explanations were another form of control. The father's body continued its quiet rebellion. His hands stiffened. His vision dimmed. He missed details he once caught instantly. Each failure irritated him deeply, not because of the loss itself, but because it contradicted the story he told himself. The boy never corrected him publicly. That mercy was unintentional. It came from indifference rather than kindness. By the time the father could no longer complete a full day's work, the boy had already adjusted the rhythm of the land around him. Tasks were reorganized. Loads were redistributed. The father was given lighter duties, framed as oversight rather than limitation. The father accepted these changes outwardly. Inwardly, they ate at him. Control had always been his identity. Without it, he did not know where to place himself. He paced more. He interfered unnecessarily. He criticized small things, searching for evidence that he was still needed. The boy endured these moments the way he had endured everything else. He did not push back. He did not reassure. He allowed the father to exhaust himself against a reality that no longer responded. As the years stacked quietly behind them, something settled between the two men. Not reconciliation, not understanding, a kind of quiet standoff shaped by habit and history. The boy had become indispensable without ever asking for it. The father had become dependent without ever admitting it. And the land, indifferent as always, continued to demand work from whichever hands could still give it. Dependence arrived without ceremony. It did not announce itself or demand acknowledgement. It simply rearranged the days until the father no longer recognized them as his own. He still woke before dawn, but the mornings confused him now. Sometimes he rose too early, standing in the dark with his boots on, unsure of what task came first. Other times he slept through the light entirely and woke irritated, as if the sun had betrayed him personally. The boy noticed, of course. He noticed everything. He said nothing. The father's body had become unreliable in ways that angered him more than pain ever had. His hands cramped without warning. His knees locked mid-step. Tools felt heavier than they should have, as if mocking him. Each failure chipped away at the certainty he had spent a lifetime building. He responded the only way he knew how, with control. He began issuing instructions more frequently, repeating them even after they had been carried out. He corrected imagined mistakes. He hovered, watching the boy work, pointing out flaws that did not exist. The boy accepted these interruptions without reaction, adjusting his movements just enough to avoid confrontation. What the father mistook for obedience was endurance refined. In town, the change was no longer subtle. Merchants deferred to the boy automatically. Contracts were discussed with him. Decisions were expected from him. The father stood nearby listening, occasionally interrupting to remind everyone who had built the land. They nodded politely. Then they turned back to the boy. That was when the father first felt it. Not fear, something sharper, irrelevance. At home, the lectures grew longer and more scattered. He spoke of values, of discipline, of how men like them were becoming rare. He warned against softness in the world, against letting standards slip. The boy listened, eyes steady, hands busy. Words passed over him like weather. The father mistook this silence for agreement. He did not see the distance growing inside it. One evening, the father tried to lift a load he had handled easily for decades. His grip failed halfway. The weight dropped, striking the ground with a dull sound that echoed too loudly. He froze, bent slightly forward, breath shallow. The boy was there instantly, not rushing, not panicked, simply present. "I've got it," the boy said. The father straightened, face flushed. "I didn't ask. I know." The boy lifted the load and carried it away without comment. The exchange lasted seconds, but something in the father cracked permanently. He turned away, jaw clenched, eyes fixed on nothing. That night, sleep refused him. He lay awake, listening to the house settle, to the quiet competence moving around him. The sound that once reassured him now unsettled him. Control was slipping, and he could feel it, even if he could not name it. He began to watch the boy differently. Not as a tool, not as an extension of himself, but as something separate, something that did not need him anymore. The realization did not bring reflection. It brought resentment. The father's criticism sharpened. He accused the boy of rushing, of cutting corners, of forgetting lessons. Each accusation carried a note of desperation the boy recognized instantly. It was the same tone the father had used on the land during bad seasons, when weather refused to obey. The boy did not defend himself. Defense implied emotional investment. He had learned long ago not to offer that. One afternoon, a neighbor stopped by unexpectedly. He spoke warmly to the boy, complimenting the improvements to the property. He spoke of the future, of expansion, of opportunity. The father listened from the porch, face tightening with every word. When the neighbor left, the father exploded. His voice rose in a way it rarely had, sharp and uncontrolled. "You think this is yours now?" he demanded. The boy looked at him calmly. "It is," he said. The truth landed like a blow. The father stepped back as if struck. For a moment he looked small. Then the anger returned, hot and defensive. "You wouldn't have anything without me," he said. "I made you." The boy nodded once. "You did." The response offered no comfort. It acknowledged the past without granting it power. The father turned away, shaking. From that day forward, the air between them thickened. Conversations grew shorter. Instructions came laced with bitterness. The father clung to routines even as they failed him, insisting on doing things himself long past the point of practicality. The boy allowed it. He had learned when to step in and when to wait. Watching the father struggle was not revenge. It was simply reality unfolding. As the months passed, the father's health worsened. His appetite faded. His hands shook more openly now. He dropped things frequently, then stared at them as if offended by their betrayal. He spoke often of his own father, of how hard he had been, of how survival required cruelty. These stories no longer carried pride. They carried justification. The boy listened, expression unchanged. He had heard these stories his entire life. They no longer explained anything. One evening the father fell. It was not dramatic. He simply misjudged a step and went down heavily, unable to rise immediately. The boy reached him quickly, steadying him, helping him up. The father did not thank him. Later that night, he sat alone at the table, staring at his hands. The boy passed by quietly, carrying tools to be put away. "Do you think I was wrong?" the father asked suddenly. The question hung in the air, fragile and unfamiliar. The boy stopped. He considered the question carefully. He understood its weight. He understood what kind of answer the father wanted. He did not give it. "I think," the boy said slowly, "that things change." The father nodded as if that settled something. It did not. From that moment on, something inside the father began to collapse inward, not outward. There were no apologies, no confessions, just a growing, gnawing awareness that the system he had built was no longer serving him. Control had once been his armor. Now it was his prison. And the boy, who had been shaped to endure anything, continued to work in silence, carrying the land forward while the past sat heavily behind him, watching, powerless. The decline stopped pretending to be temporary. What had once passed as a difficult season hardened into something permanent. The father still spoke of pushing through, of refusing to be reduced, but his body no longer responded to language. It followed its own rules now, indifferent to pride, indifferent to memory. Mornings lost their consistency. Some days he woke before dawn, fully dressed, sitting stiffly at the table, as if waiting for permission to begin. Other days he remained in bed long after the light had filled the room, staring at the ceiling with an expression that suggested calculation rather than rest. The boy adjusted without announcement. He always had. Heavy labor shifted fully into his hands. Oversight became symbolic. The father was given tasks that looked necessary but demanded little. Counting supplies that were already counted. Inspecting repairs that had already been completed. Sitting nearby while work continued. The father noticed every change. He noticed and said nothing. That silence, once deliberate, now carried confusion. He struggled to understand when authority had slipped away. In his mind, control was supposed to remain intact until death. It was not meant to thin gradually. It was not meant to embarrass him. He compensated the only way he knew how, by tightening his grip where he could. Corrections became constant. A gate closed too slowly. A tool placed in the wrong order. A decision made without consultation. Each comment was sharp, precise, and followed by a pause, as if daring the boy to react. The boy never did. That restraint unsettled the father, more than open defiance would have. There was nothing to argue against, nothing to punish. The work continued, smooth and efficient, making his authority feel unnecessary. In town, the transition was complete. People no longer waited for the father to speak. They addressed the boy directly. They discussed future seasons, investments, repairs planned years ahead. The father sat beside him, occasionally interrupting to add details no one asked for. They nodded politely. Then they returned their attention to the boy. The father stopped going to town shortly after that. He said it wasted time. He said the land required constant supervision. In truth, he could not endure the way people looked at him now. Not with contempt, with patience. Patience stripped him faster than disrespect ever could. At home, his temper grew unpredictable. He snapped over small inconveniences, then withdrew for hours. He spent long stretches sitting near the window, watching the boy work from a distance, tracking movements with an intensity that bordered on fixation. The boy felt that gaze constantly. It did not slow him. He had learned long ago that being watched did not mean being understood. One afternoon, the father insisted on helping with a task he could no longer manage safely. The boy hesitated, then stepped aside. He knew better than to argue directly. The father struggled almost immediately. His movements were stiff, his balance uncertain. The boy stayed close. When the father nearly fell, the boy reached out instinctively, steadying him. The reaction was immediate and violent. The father tore himself free, face burning. "I don't need you," he snapped. The boy stepped back. "All right." The task resumed at half its pace, awkward, inefficient, silent. Eventually, the father abandoned it entirely, claiming it was unnecessary to begin with. That night, sleep refused him. He paced the house in the dark, opening doors, closing them again. He stopped in the hallway more than once, leaning against the wall, breathing hard, listening to the quiet competence moving around him. The sound that once reassured him now unsettled him. As weeks passed, the father's world shrank. His routes shortened. His routines narrowed. He stopped walking the ridge. He stopped inspecting the far edges of the land. Distance itself seemed to threaten him now. The boy absorbed those spaces without ceremony. He repaired what needed repair. He made decisions and accepted consequences. The land responded as it always had, without judgment. The father began talking more. Not to instruct, to justify. He told stories about his own father with increasing detail, punishments, deprivations, cruel. Rules framed as necessities. He repeated the same conclusions again and again, as if repetition could convert survival into virtue. The boy listened. He had heard every version. What changed was the tone. These stories no longer sounded like lessons. They sounded like defenses. One evening, as the light faded early and the air turned sharp, the father spoke quietly, almost to himself. "I didn't have a choice." The boy continued working. He did not answer immediately. "Everyone has a choice," he said finally. The words were not angry. They were not raised. They landed softly, and that softness cut deeper than accusation ever could. The father stared at him, eyes wide, searching for contradiction. He found none. Something inside him folded inward permanently. After that, the father withdrew further. His silence returned, but it had changed. It no longer commanded. It no longer threatened. It hovered empty and ineffective. The boy noticed changes in himself as well. The patience that had once been survival had become habit. He no longer imagined leaving, not because he felt trapped, but because the land no longer felt like a cage. It felt finished. Ownership did not bring satisfaction. It brought clarity. The father's health deteriorated steadily. His hands shook openly now. His memory faltered. He forgot instructions moments after giving them. He grew irritated by his own confusion, lashing out at objects, at time, at his own body. The boy absorbed these moments without reaction. He cleaned. He repaired. He adjusted again. One night the father called out in his sleep. The boy heard his name spoken in a way it never had been before, not as an order, not as correction, as need. The boy stood in the doorway for a long moment, listening. Then he turned away and returned to his bed. Morning came as it always did. The father woke weaker than the day before. The boy woke steady. Control had once flowed in one direction only. Now it circled the father, tightening slowly, shaped by the same rules he had enforced for a lifetime. And there was no strength left to argue with. By the time the father accepted that his body was failing him, acceptance had lost its usefulness. It did not bring peace. It did not bring clarity. It arrived too late to soften anything. What it brought instead was a constant, low pressure that followed him through the day, pressing against every thought. He could no longer pretend the decline was temporary. He could no longer explain it away as fatigue or a bad season. Age had made its decision. The father moved more carefully now, as if every step required negotiation. His hands shook openly. He dropped things often, then stared at them with irritation, as if the objects themselves had betrayed him. Simple tasks took longer. Complex ones went unfinished. The boy reorganized the days again. Not abruptly, not visibly. He shortened routes, reduced lifting, shifted responsibilities quietly, so nothing appeared taken away. The land continued to function, smooth and efficient, as if nothing had changed. That was what disturbed the father most. The world did not slow down with him. It adjusted around him. He spent more time sitting, watching, listening. He followed the boy's movements with an intensity that bordered on fixation, tracking decisions he once would have made himself. The boy did not announce his choices, he acted. That efficiency reminded the father of something uncomfortable. He had built this, and yet it no longer belonged to him. The father began speaking to himself more often. Short comments, half-finished sentences, instructions spoken aloud to no one in particular. Sometimes he repeated phrases he had used on the boy years ago, as if rehearsing authority might restore it. It never did. One afternoon, he attempted to repair a fence on his own. He did not tell the boy. He waited until the work had begun elsewhere, then took the tools and walked out slowly, deliberately, as if proving something to himself. It went poorly. The wire slipped from his grip. His balance faltered. He caught himself against the post, breathing hard, heart racing. When the boy noticed and came over, the father reacted with fury. "I said I've got it," he snapped. The boy looked at him steadily. He did not argue. He did not step back. "No, you don't," he said. The words were simple, flat, irrefutable. The father froze. For a moment it looked as if he might strike him. Then the strength left his shoulders. He turned away, ashamed and exhausted. That night the father did not eat. He pushed the plate away untouched, staring at the table. The boy cleaned up without comment. Silence had long ago replaced conversation between them. As days passed, the father's isolation deepened. He no longer accompanied the boy on rounds. He no longer corrected work. He watched from the porch or the window, shrinking inward as the land expanded outward beyond his reach. Sleep became fragmented. He woke often, disoriented, unsure of the hour. Sometimes he called out sharply, expecting the boy to answer immediately as he once had. Sometimes he forgot what he had wanted to say. The boy answered when called. He did not rush. In town, word spread quietly that the father was no longer well. People spoke gently now, too gently. When they did see him, they asked how he was feeling instead of how the work was going. That change unsettled him deeply. He did not want care. He wanted relevance. He spoke bitterly of the world becoming weak, of respect disappearing, of sons forgetting what they owed. The boy listened without interruption. These complaints were not directed at him anymore. They were directed at time itself. One evening, the father began sorting through old tools. He laid them out carefully, one by one, hands shaking. Tools he had used when he was young. Tools he had forced into the boy's hands before they fit properly. He picked one up, turning it slowly. "You remember this," he said. "Yes," the boy replied. The father waited, as if expecting something more. Gratitude, recognition, validation. It did not come. He set the tool down carefully, as if it were fragile. Later that night, the father spoke again, quietly. "I did what I had to do." The boy did not answer immediately. He considered the sentence the way one considers weather. A fact, not a justification. "You did what you chose," he said. The father closed his eyes. The words landed heavily. He did not argue. There was no argument left to make. After that, something inside the father began to fracture more visibly. He grew withdrawn. His appetite faded further. His movements slowed until even standing required effort. The boy assumed full control without announcing it. He signed agreements, made plans, spoke for the land entirely. The father watched from a distance, powerless and increasingly aware of it. What haunted him most was not cruelty remembered. It was cruelty that no longer mattered. He had believed suffering shaped loyalty. He had believed fear ensured permanence. He had believed control could be enforced indefinitely. Old age proved otherwise. One morning the father attempted to rise and could not. His legs refused him entirely. He sat there breathing hard, staring at his own hands in disbelief. The boy found him that way and said nothing. He helped him up carefully and guided him back to bed. The father did not resist. That surrender frightened him more than pain ever had. From that day forward, he required assistance for almost everything: walking, dressing, eating. Each act stripped another layer of authority away. Each moment of dependence reminded him of what he had done to the boy. Only now the roles were fixed. The boy carried out his care with the same efficiency he had learned as a child. No anger, no tenderness, just consistency, and the father, lying there in the quiet he had created over a lifetime, began to understand the shape of his punishment. It was not revenge. It was continuity. The same rules, the same silence, the same endurance. Only now, he was the one who could not escape it. Old age did not arrive all at once. It came in layers, each one thinner than the last, each one harder to notice, until the weight became impossible to ignore. By the time the father understood that he would not recover, his understanding itself had lost urgency. His body had crossed a boundary it could not retreat from, and his authority had crossed that boundary years earlier, unnoticed at the time, unchallenged until it no longer mattered. The room where he spent his days seemed to shrink, not in size but in significance. The walls remained where they had always been. The ceiling did not lower, yet everything inside the room felt closer, heavier, more final. The window faced the land he had ruled for most of his life. He watched it now like a stranger. Men worked without looking toward the house. Animals moved according to routine rather than command. Seasons passed without ceremony. For the first time, nothing waited for his approval. The boy moved through the house with quiet precision. He woke early. He prepared food. He tended to the father's failing body with the same consistency. He brought to the fields. There was no resentment in his movements, but there was no warmth either. Care, when stripped of affection, resembled duty. Duty, when perfected, felt unyielding. In the beginning, the father still tried to assert himself. He corrected how the bed was arranged. He complained about the temperature of the water. He remarked on timing, on placement, on details that once would have drawn punishment if ignored. The boy listened. He nodded. And then he continued doing exactly what needed to be done. The father noticed that nothing changed. He raised his voice once, then again. Both attempts ended in breathlessness. His chest tightened. His heart raced. The boy waited patiently until the episode passed, then resumed his work. No apology was offered. No explanation was required. Gradually the corrections stopped. Speaking demanded energy now. Even anger required strength. Silence became the default, not because it was chosen, but because it was all that remained. The father spent long hours alone with his thoughts. They did not arrive in order. Memories surfaced without permission. His own father appeared often, not as a figure of comfort, but as a source of rules and consequences. He remembered punishments administered without explanation. Expectations never discussed, only enforced. He had told himself it was survival. He had called it discipline. He had named it love because love sounded better than fear. Now survival felt like a sentence rather than a victory. At night, the house fell into a quiet he knew intimately. It was the same quiet he had imposed on the boy decades earlier. No conversation, no reassurance, just shared space without connection. The father began to realize that this silence was intentional. One afternoon, his hands shook badly as he lifted the water glass. The tremor sent liquid spilling across the sheets. Panic surged in his chest. His breathing became shallow. He stared at the mess as if it were proof of something he had tried to deny. The boy cleaned it without comment. He changed the bedding, replaced the glass, adjusted the pillow, and returned to his routine. The father watched him closely. "You don't hate me," the father said suddenly. It was not a question. The boy paused only briefly. "I don't," he replied. The answer disturbed the father more than anger ever could have. Hatred required attachment. Hatred suggested unfinished business. This felt like closure. As weeks passed, the father's body continued to weaken. Sleep overtook most of his days. His thoughts wandered freely now, untethered by logic or pride. Sometimes he spoke to the boy as if he were still a child, issuing commands that no longer made sense. The boy did not argue. He did not correct him. There were moments when the father woke disoriented, fear sharp and immediate. In those moments he reached out instinctively, searching for reassurance he had never learned to give. The boy steadied him always, and always without comfort. That absence became heavier than pain. One evening, as the sun lowered and cast long shadows across the land, the father finally asked the question he had avoided for years. "Did I break you?" The boy considered the question carefully. He had learned long ago that rushing answers invited consequences. "No," he said. "You used me." The distinction settled heavily between them. Breaking implied damage beyond repair. Use implied intention. The father closed his eyes. His breathing faltered. That truth carried weight because it removed excuses. Use meant choice. Use meant awareness. From that day forward, the father spoke very little. He seemed to turn inward, replaying his life without the protection of justification. When he did speak, his words were fragmented, memories surfacing without order or defense. Moments he had dismissed as necessary returned with sharp clarity. The boy listened when spoken to. He responded only when required. As winter approached, the father's decline accelerated. Standing became impossible. His hands curled inward, stiff and unreliable. Eating required effort. Sleeping brought little rest. Outside, the land followed its rhythm without pause. On the last morning, he was fully aware. The father asked to be moved closer to the window. The boy complied, positioning the bed so the fields were clearly visible. "This is all I ever knew," the father said quietly. The boy did not answer. After a long silence, the father spoke again. "I thought control was love." The boy adjusted the blanket with practiced care. "Control lasts," he said. "Love doesn't need to." The father looked at him then, truly looked at him, and understood something he had never allowed himself to consider. Control had outlived affection. Fear had replaced loyalty. Obedience had buried connection. He died quietly not long after. No final confession, no absolution, just breath slowing, then stopping, in the same controlled silence he had enforced throughout his life. The boy remained beside the bed for a long moment. He did not kneel. He did not weep. He simply acknowledged the stillness. Then he returned to the land. The work continued. It always had. Years later, people spoke of the father as a hard man, a disciplined man, a man shaped by his time. The boy never corrected them. Explanation no longer mattered. He lived his life steady and unremarkable, shaped by endurance but no longer ruled by it. The land prospered. Seasons turned, and the lesson remained quiet and unavoidable. Some men believe control is permanent. Some believe fear creates loyalty. Some believe strength excuses cruelty. Old age proves otherwise, because the rules you enforce on others do not vanish. They wait, and when they return to you stripped of mercy and memory, there is nothing left to negotiate with. If you stayed until the end, You already understand something most people learn too late. Subscribe for more long stories about cruelty, time, and the punishments that only old age can deliver.